Hi there, everyone. This is Martin Hoxie from the Association for Learning Technology, and thank you for joining us for our latest ALT community call, where I'm very grateful to be joined by Rob Paley from Excensus, who's, we were just chatting before the call, has a long history working within educational technology. So Rod, welcome.
Well, thank you, Martin. It's very nice to be here.
I wonder if you could just share some of your background with our audience. Perhaps a bit more about Excensus, but if people aren't familiar with that, and, some of the work you've done.
Okay. So, well, I've been working for about 12 years now at Excensus in one guise or another. We started off our lives in the school sector. We were quite actively involved in some of the Education Action Zone programs. And then in about 2000 and something, we got actively involved with a new project the then Learning and Schools Council was funding, and that was called the National Learning Network. And we became a big part of the NLN materials team, working with Vector and a range of other partners. So yes, our history does stretch back quite a way now. I mean, NLN is quite long in the tooth, but it's still very actively used, in fact, and we still do run that for the now Education and Training Fund, the ETF.
So for people not familiar with the NLN, can you just give a bit more background about what that is and how it's evolved?
Sure. Well, as I say, it was part of a much wider scheme at the time that the Learning and Schools Council had in mind to provide the further education sector, in the first instance, with a combination of equipment and training and support to use new technologies, to adopt virtual learning environments. At that time, the sector hadn't converged on Moodle as it has now. So there were a range of different kind of competing alternatives then. And part of the strategy was to develop some interactive materials that would cover quite a wide range of subject areas within the vocational sector, and to ensure that the content was very readily accessible, easy to use, easy to find, and easy to bring into these new environments. And that's where we came in. That was our role. In the first instance, we were kind of content managers and repository developers. We've moved on a bit since then, as I'm sure we'll come on to during the call. So our role was to help the different suppliers of the resources, and there are about 23 or 24 external, primarily commercial suppliers, ranging from Epic and Granada Learning right through to the BBC, in fact, and ensure that their content was built in a particular way and conformed to the then emerging international standards for content packaging and metadata and so forth, and to ensure that once it was built, as wide a section of the community will be able to access it and utilize it quickly and easily. So in a nutshell, that's a very quick 100-mile-an-hour tour of what NLN was all about. That's how it started. That was the origin, and that was our involvement.
It's interesting how, there's always these cycles within our sector, and I suppose there's a lot. Do you see a lot of parallels with what's going on with things like FELTAG? And I know you're involved in the Blended Learning Consortium as well.
Well, FELTAG and similar kind of initiatives were well underway even then. In fact, we drew a lot of inspiration from that FELTAG when they were doing some really interesting things. I'm thinking of FEARL, actually. I'm getting my acronyms mixed up. The other thing that's happened over the last 15 years, there's been a whole development of different acronyms. But what I was going on to say was that there were lots of really interesting ideas around the time which were developed and then either kind of slipped into obsolescence or whose funding streams have been withdrawn. And yeah, coming through to that cycle, then I suppose FELTAG is the latest, the most dominant, and has been a very successful movement, I think, in terms of bringing the sector together post-Vector, post-Quango, if you like, and enabling it to come up with some ideas and some potential solutions to some of the problems that people face. So it's very exciting to see it. And I suppose the thing that differentiates FELTAG from those more centralized kind of top-down initiatives like NLN is it's much more a kind of sector-driven initiative. And one of its outgrowths is something called the Blended Learning Consortium, which absolutely is a kind of self-organized, self-starting group of colleges that have got together to say, hey, we need a new batch of content, we need a new NLN. I'm sure they didn't think of it in those terms, but we've got the wherewithal, we've got the skill sets, we can do this ourselves now. So that's very encouraging and it's very exciting, and it's part of this process that started off such a long time ago, and we're still involved in.
So for people not familiar with Blended Learning Consortium, can you give a brief pitch or a brief explanation what that is?
Yes. Okay. I mean, I should say straight away, this is not our consortium. We're happy to be partnering with it. It's something that has stemmed out of work done at Heart of Worcester College. I'm sure everybody's aware they've developed a kind of blended learning model, starting with something called SOLAR, Scheduled Online Learning Assessment, which has been very successful by all accounts, and has certainly caught the eyes of others in the sector, including the FELTAG movement, if I can call it that, the FELTAG initiative. And they have, as part of the blended learning concept and their definition of it, they have decided to pull some resources together, to make some resources that can be used by practitioners in the sector, which the sector has come together. I think there are about 65 or so now colleges that are part of this consortium. So they've come up with the funding, they've come up with the ideas about what the money should be spent on, what kind of content, what areas, where there are gaps in the market or gaps in provision currently, or whether there are areas that are particularly susceptible to being helped and supported using online learning. And they very recently, in fact it was last week, had a kind of launch conference at which we were invited to come and showcase our contribution to this consortium, which is in the same way as NLN, to provide an access interface such that practitioners can quickly browse to resources that have been created, preview them, and then either bring them into their environment, whether that be a Moodle learning environment or any other environment that they happen to use. Wherever the interaction takes place between students and teachers, they can bring the Blended Learning Consortium resources into play. And optionally, and this is where we come in, and this is what we think where we add quite a bit of value to this. They can add those resources to collections of other resources, and they could be BLC resources, but they equally could be resources from elsewhere, NLN resources, YouTube videos, or indeed resources created by the practitioners themselves.
So you've already mentioned there've been a number of initiatives to pull together resources and present them to users, to educators.
Yes.
So it's particular about the way that you approach this that you think is unique, or provide something that other solutions, well, we do have Joe, but not for much longer. Which in a way makes you unique in that way.
Okay.
But okay. I just wonder, perhaps it's easier to see what you're talking about. Is there anything that you feel that your platform does that? Is it the integration really? Is that the
Yes, I think so. I think so. I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that we've kind of moved on a little bit from our initial role as repository providers. And a lot of that was driven by our experience running NLN, because it was a very substantial initiative, and there were lots and lots of practitioners. I think about 25,000 practitioners had accounts on our NLN site. And that's a really important part, by the way, of the initiative, because although it was about creating materials, it was also about building a community around those materials, and that's really, really fundamental. And it's a big lesson that I think could and should inform other initiatives. And I know that the BLC initiative is placing great emphasis on supporting and advising and training the community that is going to build up around that content set. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that however easy we made it for people to find NLN resources from a kind of repository perspective, the practitioners are still nevertheless left with the dilemma of so what do I do with them now? Can I preview them? Do I have enough information about them on this particular repository? And can I bring them into my environment? Can I bring them into my Moodle? Can I bring them into wherever I'm teaching, wherever teaching and learning is taking place? And can I meld it with content from elsewhere? Because at the end of the day, NLN was never going to be the entire supplier of resources for the FE sector. It was never intended to be, and nor will BLC. So practitioners are always needing to bring content in from different sources. And there have been initiatives to bring repositories of repositories together. Things like the Excellence Gateway, for example, is a good example of that. Durham, in a sense, was an example of that, because it not only had content that it had uploaded or had the sector upload, but it was aggregating smaller repositories of content from elsewhere around the country. And we felt that there was a real need to help the practitioners, not so much with that content aggregation, but with the collection and delivery of that content. So we're agnostic about where the content actually is sourced from. If it's Durham, that's great. If it's NLN, that's fine. If it's BLC, if it's on the web, if it's teachers' own files, the challenge is to bring it into a usable environment where you can collate them, organize them, annotate them, contextualize them, and then make them available to your students. So that's where we started. In fact, we had a collections capability within the NLN site, and that was massively popular, precisely because it gave the practitioners some control. It enabled them to bring individual NLN resources into a basket, which they could then customize and pass the URL off to their students. And there was an overwhelming cry for that functionality to be expanded, such that we could bring resources from anywhere into play and press into service resources that practitioners have made themselves. So those are the origins. That's why we think it's different. We're not competing with the Durham or any other repositories. We're providing, we think, a very complementary and very valuable service that sits in the space between repositories and sources of content and wherever teaching and learning takes place. That's a rather long-winded answer to your question.
No, I think it's really, as someone that's come from a standards and interoperability background, you know, I appreciate the challenge of actually doing that as well.
Sure.
So yeah, it's interesting how you know, things have evolved, but there's still, I think, you know, in some ways it's a bit easier, but you know, there's still some, I suppose, technical challenges, but also the human challenges of doing this as well. Yeah.
I think one of the problems with some of the bigger, earlier initiatives, and NLN was probably one of those, was that it didn't hide the technology enough from practitioners. And I think probably scared quite a few people away with talks of metadata and SCORM and packaging and all that kind of stuff. And there were some initial tools that were developed to help practitioners. The idea was that they were going to be able to disaggregate the content and then reaggregate it. And they were rather challenging tools for anyone to have to use. So, but since then, as you say, the world's moved on. These kind of tools are available. We don't need lots of external contractors to build content anymore. That's certainly something that's well within the realm of and capability of practitioners, and certainly specialist teams within colleges, which is how BLC has come about. But nevertheless, we think it's really, really important to be able to hide the complexity of this aggregation, this content collection and delivery as much as possible, and certainly hide it from learners so that when they get to experience and enjoy and interact with and utilize the materials, they can do so in a nice, uncluttered and modern browsing way. And that still eludes quite a lot of learning technology today, I would suggest.
The geek in me is desperate to ask, for some of these, what technologies are hidden behind the scenes. So I'm probably going to lose half the audience when I start mentioning things like LTI and LRNI, things like that. Do you want to go down that route, or should we?
Well, I tell you, I certainly don't want to lose half our audience. I don't want to. I suppose at one conceptual level, what we're doing is providing a social bookmarking service for teachers. It's sort of delicious for teachers, if I can put it that way. So we have a similar kind of bookmarklet for practitioners to utilize. It sits on your browser toolbar and actually can be embedded in repositories and appear in lots of different guises. But the idea is that we have a little bit of technology in that bookmarklet which will analyze a resource, and depending on where that resource is, and of course we've been around for quite a long time, so we know about a lot of pre-existing, we know about Jorum, we know about the gateway, we already run NLN, so in some cases there are IDs that we can recognize, which helps us to pull in lots of useful information about those resources. And in others we use OE Exchange. There are plenty of nice standards sitting around now, and our job is to utilize the most appropriate ones at the time so that we can pull that resource in. That all the practitioner is doing is hitting this little bookmarklet, but we're doing lots of beavering behind the scenes, going, oh, that's okay, that's a YouTube video, here's the title, description. It's got two URLs on a YouTube video, obviously. One is to the information page with all of the extraneous, potentially extraneous, at one point potentially useful to practitioners, alternative videos and comments and so forth. But once the teacher has selected that video and is wanting to present it alongside videos in a collection, they really only want the student to be seeing that particular video. So we'll take separately the URL to the content itself and store that. That's something we got from NLN, by the way, because NLN had lots and lots of really useful metadata to help the practitioners decide how this resource could be used and should be used and had been used in the past. But that's not information that's useful or interesting to a learner at all. They just want to get on with the content itself. So that separation of the information about the content and then the content itself is a really kind of fundamental part of what we do. And that allows us to put these pretty themes and backgrounds together, which maybe the geek in you, Martin, is not quite so excited about, but we think it's really important. And we're big, we're big on images and thumbnails and visual cues as to what the resources are all about and what the collections are about. And all that can be fitted and formatted and embedded in a VLE so that the experience for the learner is as close to browsing around the web as possible. But all of that complex adding and manipulating of information about the resource is done in the background. Does that help? And how many people have we lost?
It helps. I just as a, so the community calls, it's about touching base with, our alt membership, and I know that Extensis is an organisational member of alt, and I also know that as part of that you're quite active in the open educational SIG, which is organised by alt members. So
yes,
which leads me on related to that. You talked about pulling out information about resources, and I just wondered, because I know there'll be quite a few people interested from an alt perspective about Creative Commons and
yes,
open resources. So is that something that when people are creating their own collections, is it quite easy for people to remix and have different licenses in, that sort of thing?
Okay, great. Oh, well, that's a really, yeah, I should have said something, or we should have talked a bit about the initial contact that we had with alt, which was all about using XTLearn to bring different sources of content into play. And I'm not talking about just about different formats now, but yeah, of course, content with different licenses. So yeah, we I suppose, philosophically speaking, we're agnostic about the provenance of content and the type of license. But while we're doing that background check on resources as we bring them into the system, one of the things we're checking on, of course, is license. And we, there are two fundamental types of resource that XTLearn handles. One is a web-based resource, which we're effectively gathering from the web, and another is a created resource, which you either create from pre-existing files or using a little content editing tool that we've just developed. And yes, you can assign a license at that point, and that can be anything from Creative Commons, whichever one you wish, right the way through to kind of paid for license, and then there are schemes of authentication and so forth, and paywalls that we have to put in place for that. So yeah, I mean, we're very interested. I mean, in fact, we've been to, as you rightly say, we're part of the OER SIG. We went to OER 15, I think it was, in Cardiff, and I know there's OER 17 coming up, and we're very keen to find a way of being involved with and supporting that kind of activity, whether it be on a kind of OER only basis, or whether alternates members and the initiatives are prepared to go for more of a kind of mixed bag or mixed market. We don't really mind. We can support both. So yeah, we would be very interested and continue to be interested in talking to initiatives and groups that want to do something in that area, because we think this technology has got something to offer them.
What's your, so there's
I'm actually just beginning to lose you there, Martin. I'm afraid you've slightly frozen on me. Hello? Yeah, I'm sorry, Martin, you've gone. You've stopped. I don't know if it's something that's your end or this end.
Sorry, I lost you for a second.
Ah, you're back. Hi. I was trying to anticipate your question and give an answer in your absence, but I couldn't, I'm afraid.
So, fortunately, I've been able to come quite quickly. I just wondered, from your experiences with working with different partners, where openness, are people coming to you and saying, does your product support open educational licenses, or do you think that whole area is still very niche? And similar to what you've developed hides a lot of the what might be described the messy mechanics. People just want to get on with it. is that your sense you're getting from the people you're talking to? They're less concerned about licenses and just want to get things done.
Yeah, well, we're in that camp. We really like to get things done, and we think we've got tools that make it really quite easy now for people just to jump in and start playing with and messing with and organizing and mashing up resources and sharing them. So we were very excited to hear about, you know, the OER movement, and you know, you were talking at the beginning of the call about different kind of zeitgeists and phases and so forth. And OER 15, when we went in Cardiff, was full of kind of enthusiasm and theoretical ideas, but also lots of really interesting practical applications. There was a whole network of schools in Leicester, I seem to recall, that certainly kind of from a policy perspective had bought into and were keen to implement those ideas. So I suppose from a marriage point of view, we would like to find some way of being involved and supporting those, if that's at all possible. I think there are some open source type OER aggregators that exist and abound, and that's useful, but it really doesn't do it's part of the solution to the problem, I think, possibly, but it's a bit more philosophically like the gateway. It's kind of, they're aggregating repositories. So something nice and nimble like us, Martin, I think could play quite a neat role. So if there is anybody out there who wants to just get going with OER, even on a small scale basis, maybe that's the best way to start. We'd be happy. We're certainly going to come up to OER 17 and see if we can hook up with some folk there.
Just to try and unpick that, do you think, you know, we talk about OER quite a bit, but is it, do you think, I don't want to describe it as a problem that we've created or a solution, but, you know, artificially, but it sounds like the Blended Learning Consortium are doing, you know, they've got a foundation for some really interesting and great stuff.
Yeah.
And that obviously isn't, it's not OER, you know.
It's not.
And I just wondered, you know, I suppose the danger is I'm going to answer my own question.
I think you must.
There's obviously many flavors, isn't there?
Yeah.
And so, you know, you're trying to fit into that kind of the store of many flavors. You're trying to fulfill what you.
Here's the deal. I mean, when we first came into contact with ALT, it was around, as I mentioned just before, it was around government-funded project. It was the Technology Strategy Board, okay, and our pitch to them was lots and lots of different competing models out there. There are publishers with masses and masses of legacy content which they want to sell. At the one end of the spectrum, there's lots and lots of free stuff, NLN, for example, Furl, some of those other initiatives that I mentioned that we were involved with many, many moons ago. And then there's the World Wide Web. And then there's this new movement, relatively new movement, to do with open education resources. And nobody quite knows how this is going to pan out. I mean, you know, the publishers don't know. So they're thinking, so what the model's going to look like, and what kind of models for selling the content do we need, or should we be selling content? Should we be selling access to content and giving tools and support around the content? And then OER is taking a kind of more purist view about how the content should be generated and how it should be distributed and utilized. So, and I remember at the time, ALT was very, very keen to place itself, you know, in the vanguard of OER, and they didn't want to be involved in the project unless it was quite clear that that's where they saw themselves sitting at the kind of the head of this. But nevertheless, there was an interesting role they could play in terms of helping the research, and the idea was we're going to establish lots of different practice groups who were going to be bringing content together from different sources. So we've always said, look, we don't really mind, and we don't know where this market is going and how it's going to evolve. So it's easy for us, isn't it, to say we're agnostic, and we still are. And if OER ends up being triumphant, well, that's great. I'm sure that as things develop, more and more resources that currently are not OER will become OER. More and more stuff that's currently being charged for will not be charged for. But exactly where on that continuum will end up, I don't know. We don't mind.
Well, on that note, I'm conscious of the time, so but what we'll do is there are a number of things that we can put together as part of this call. So what I can do with you, Rod, if it's okay with you, is we can put a blog post together for the Alt-C blog, so we can share some of the things for people to go and look at.
Sure.
And finally, Rod, thank you very much for your time. It's been fascinating to unpick some of and how things are evolving. So thank you very much for your time.
No, not at all, man. It's been really fun. I've enjoyed it. I enjoyed chatting to you in the run up to the call and the actual call itself. So thank you.
And we always ask. We've obviously got the annual conference coming up. Will someone from Extensus, yourself, be popping in for a day for that, or will you be?
I will be there myself.
That's great. So we look forward to seeing you in work. So
likewise.
Thanks again very much.
Thanks, Martin.